Sego, bonjour tout le monde, hello and welcome to this session of the MISC annual conference, which focuses on the next steps of reconciliation in Canada. I would like to begin this session by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part of. Je vais maintenant vous présenter notre modératrice, Emily Gilpin. Emily is a Michif Métis Filipina and of European descent. She currently lives and works as a visitor in Washinich territory on southern Vancouver Island. She is a journalist, editor, and educator who led Canada's National Observer's First Nations Forward series dedicated to stories of success and self-determination in First Nations communities across BC. And she has been doing that for 3 years now. In October 2022, she became the managing editor of Indigenews, you have to say it properly, Indigenews, an online independent media outlet amplifying the stories of Indigenous communities in the Okanagan and across Vancouver Island. Emily advocates for and facilitates training on anti-oppressive, decolonial, and ethical approaches to journalism. Emily, c'est à vous. Merci.
Merci, thank you. Hi. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. As mentioned, I'm joining you from Washinich territory on a beautiful rainy fall day. I love this season and this time of transition and all of the teachings that it carries. My name is Emily Gilpin, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's panel on the next steps of reconciliation in Canada. So I don't want to take up too much space. I'd like to just jump right in and begin by introducing and thanking our panelists in advance who have joined us to lend their invaluable perspectives to this conversation. We'll hear brief remarks from each of the panelists, and then I'll ask each of them some questions. So to start off, I'd like to introduce Haudenosaunee, or Janice Hill, who leads the Office of Indigenous Initiatives at Queen's University, providing strategic support and leadership to university-wide to oversee the implementation from the Queen's Truth and Reconciliation Commission Task Force report recommendations. Janice is Turtle Clan, a clan mother of the Mohawk Nation from Tyendinaga, Mohawk Territory. She began her academic career as an adjunct faculty member in the Faculty of Education and went on to help establish the Aboriginal Teacher Education Program, serving as academic co-director for the program in 1997 to 1998. Janice is in the process of completing her Master's of Arts in Gender Studies at Queen's, and she served as director of the Four Directions Indigenous Student Center for 7 years prior to being appointed as the Director of Indigenous Initiatives and most recently, the Associate Vice Principal of the Indigenous Initiatives and Reconciliation. So we'll hear from Janice and looking forward to it. Next on our panel is Professor Val Napoleon, who's the Acting Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria and the Law Foundation Chair of Indigenous Justice and Governance. She's the co-founder of the JID-JD Dual Degree Program in Indigenous Legal Orders and Canadian Common Law, and the founding director of the Indigenous Law Research Unit. She is Cree from Saulteaux First Nation and adopted member into the Gitineau, Northern Gitxsan. Areas are Indigenous legal traditions and methodologies like land, water, governance, and democracy, human rights, gender, dispute resolution, and intellectual property. Indigenous legal theories, Indigenous feminisms, legal pluralism, Indigenous democracy, and Indigenous intellectual property. She teaches common property law and Gitxsan land and property law trans-systemically in the JID and JD program. So we look forward to hearing from Val as well. Our third and final panelist is Ghislain Picard, Chief of the Assembly of First Nations in Quebec, Labrador. He is Innu from the community of Pessamit. As AFN-QL Chief, he sits on the Assembly of First Nations Executive Committee and Management Committee, and he is the spokesperson for the Comprehensive Claims, Urban Population and International Issues portfolios. In 2014, in Halifax, the Chiefs in Assembly unanimously appointed him as National Chief. He occupied this function until 2014, and then resumed his position as chief of the AFN-QL. In 2003, Mr. Picard received the National Order of Quebec. On January 24th, 2005, he received the distinguished insignia of Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur from the Consulate General of France. So we have a very esteemed panelist today, really looking forward to hearing from each of them. If we could start with you, Janice, if you could share more of your opening remarks, and then we'll move on to Val and back to Ghislaine. Thank you.
Niala, and thank you very much, Emily, and welcome everyone. I join you from beautiful, sunny Kingston, Ontario today, the land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. So, sego se wagwego, wat kwenu horadu, ganu shuni yungyats, garahuine, Catherine Brandt goha yun dudjets, ne agate nistoha, dano lenix hill goha rungwayats, ne ragate niha, wagenyatu, ganyoke haga, niwagwin hojum. Gundege Nidawagenu, Gundege Gunagari. So as you've heard, Ganoshuni is what they call me. It means she's making a house. My deceased mother was Catherine Brandt, and my deceased father was Lennox Hill. He was Wolf Clan. I'm Turtle Clan, as you heard, from the Mohawk Nation, and I'm from Gundege, which is one of our traditional words for Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, and that is also where I currently live. It's really important to me in all the work that I do to position myself before I speak to anybody so that you know where I'm speaking to you from, what my frame of reference is, you know, who my people are. In a longer time period, I tell you about my children and grandparents and so on for 7 generations, but we don't have time for all of that today. I'd also like to begin by giving thanks and acknowledgement to all of creation for continuing to fulfill instructions given at the beginning of time, and thereby allowing us to continue here as human beings. This is my responsibility as Ungwahungwe. It's the one instruction that we were given at the beginning of time, is to always be grateful and to acknowledge all that has been provided by creation. As you also heard, I am the Associate Vice Principal, Indigenous Initiatives and Reconciliation at Queen's University here in Kingston. I've been asked to share with you today some of my thoughts on next steps for reconciliation in Canada. In order to frame my thoughts, I thought I would like to share a quote from Senator Murray Sinclair, who is our new Chancellor at Queen's University and whom we're very happy to have working with us now. He stated, reconciliation is not something that government can legislate into reality, and it's not something Indigenous people can force on the rest of Canada. Every person in Canada, every citizen, every immigrant, every refugee, and every visitor is responsible for reconciliation. I believe this is true. But also, I believe there is still a long road ahead to convincing the Canadian population that this is so and encouraging them to pick up this work. I like to believe, perhaps naively, that we have many allies and accomplices in this work, but I don't think we've reached a tipping point, enough to have significant impact. A lot of the times, it feels, of course, like we're singing to the choir. The people who are of like mind and who believe the same way we do are the people that generally congregate and have these conversations. Many people, I think, are still struggling with understanding, acknowledging, and accepting the truth of how we got here to this point. Many people, I think, are still in denial. They don't like to think of how we got here and what was done to our people and our children in history. No one likes to think about those things. They're not nice things to think about. But it's necessary. It's necessary to face the truth in order to move ahead in a good way. Indigenous and non-Indigenous members of this country have different roles to play in the truth and reconciliation landscape. Many people, particularly many Indigenous people, struggle with the word and concept of reconciliation and what it means. It implies that a good relationship once existed that now needs to be made right again. I know there are some Haudenosaunee people who say that we did once have a good and equal relationship. It was when we were useful, in times of war, when our warriors were needed and the strength of our people was needed. But as that time passed, our relationship deteriorated, and over time, we too became seen as wards or dependents, and we were less than equals. In Ganyuk Geha, or the Mohawk language, our word for reconciliation that one of our elder speakers told me is Aunse Yoyanara Yoyanerene, which I understand to means talking about making something right again. So it's similar to how we understand the word reconciliation. Through conversations with colleagues, most specifically Dr. Kim Anderson, my understanding has come to be that reconciliation is about land, language, and kinship. This is particularly true for Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been displaced from their homelands over history, those who have lost their languages due to residential schools and government policies and churches, and those who have become distanced from their traditional forms of kinship and relationships, also due to displacement and the residential school system. Generations of our people have been and continue to be affected by the residential school system, and many are seeking to find their way back to their original teachings, their languages, their families and relations, to their authentic selves. As I have come to understand it, reconciliation is primarily the work of Canadians, just as Justice Sinclair said. Resurgence is the work of us as Indigenous peoples who work on reclaiming and reviving our languages, our cultures, our ways of knowing and being. The juncture of the two is where I see the work of decolonizing and indigenizing, of unlearning and relearning. That is the work encouraged by the Office of Indigenous Initiatives here at Queen's University. This work of unlearning and relearning, of identifying and dismantling oppression. Again, to quote Senator Sinclair, education is what got us here, and education is what will get us out. Education is the key to reconciliation. Education in its myriad forms is required to complete the picture of our shared history in this country. Up until very recently, this picture has been partial, hidden, or intentionally covered up. For this reason, many people are still at the point of acknowledging, understanding, and accepting the truth. To put reconciliation into action, to engage in real allyship, to truly dismantle oppression, we need universities, communities, and many other institutions to begin this conversation and to engage in the education process. Reconciliation starts with allies, accomplices, settlers, citizens, everyone becoming educated on the important issues and histories, as well as the current realities of Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation must be about moving forward in a better way. Part of moving forward in a better way is by continuing to listen to Indigenous peoples, acting on the priorities that have been identified, and addressing the past wrongs. Reports and recommendations, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, even as far back as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People and the National Indian Brotherhood, Indian Control of Indian Education from the 70s, must all be acted upon. More reports and research ends up garnering the same information and the same or similar calls to action. I think the time for talk is past and the time for action is now. Displaying such actions, in my estimation, would definitely be a step towards reconciliation. Nyawat Giwahi for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Janice, for your words. I have many questions stemming from that very meaningful opening session. So thank you. Passing it over to Val.
I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I am joining you from the somewhat rainy lands of the Lekwungen speaking people here in Victoria. So reconciliation is one of those words that is defined by the experiences of the people who are speaking it. So if people are coming from an educational perspective, then that informs the scope and expectations of reconciliation. So I come from a perspective of law. I teach and work with Indigenous law here in the law school, but we also have we do a lot of work with Indigenous communities across the country about, articulating, researching specific questions that people have about their own laws and helping to rebuild around questions of those laws. And we work with land and water resources, citizenship, human rights, and we look at all of these different questions from Indigenous perspective, and we draw on Indigenous resources to substantively articulate Indigenous law around those questions, along with processes and so on. So that's the perspective I'm bringing. The other part of the perspective that I bring to the conversation is with the amazing Indigenous Law Degree program that we have. Students here receive 2 law degrees, one in Indigenous law and one in Canadian law. This coming spring, our first cohorts of our 4-year program are going to be graduating. So our first students are going to be out in the world, across Canada today with their 2 law degrees. So it's bringing together the study of law. I teach, for instance, Gitxsan land and property law alongside Canadian or common law property law. And my colleagues, John Burrows teaches Anishinaabeg constitutional law alongside Canadian constitutional law. So what we're doing is bringing together ways that Indigenous peoples from pre-contact and everything else, how people have organized and managed themselves through time. And so we draw on those resources in the classroom, and we look at how, there's the work that the previous generations have done to set out what the laws are around each area of human life. And then there's contemporary problems and issues that the current generation has that law has to apply to. So it's a living process. It's not about going back in time. So there are aspects of that are reconciliation in terms of past and present Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous institutions and laws, and then bringing those to do the work that Indigenous communities need today. And then there's thinking through what are the connections and similarities between various legal orders, between Cree, between Gitxsan, between Tsilhqot'in, between Secwepemc, like the different Indigenous legal orders that people have. And then also, what are the similarities and differences with Canadian law, in this case, common law. So we're constantly thinking through differences, patterns, similarities, context, which is important to understanding the problems and work to be done that are, again, these are things that communities, this is work communities are doing now. So that's part of what I see as being really important for a conversation about reconciliation. Indigenous law has to be a part of that work otherwise, Canadian law is the only terms of reference. And that's a problem, right? It's another, if we don't have Indigenous law as a front and center part of conversations about Indigenous law, then we're in danger of perpetuating the power imbalances which rendered our laws invisible in the first place. And so we're having to do this rebuilding of Indigenous laws. So that's a part of it. The other couple of things in the time that I have is that there's a lot of work for Indigenous communities to do internally. Like the recent history has undermined our legal orders, has undermined governance and so on. We know this from our histories and current situations. So we have conflicts, we have power imbalances, we have gender issues. These are all issues that are our responsibilities as Indigenous peoples to attend to. So that's an internal reconciliation that's necessary. And then there's the external reconciliations between Indigenous peoples and with Canada, with the state. So that's other work. And back to my earlier comment, it's important to think about to get beyond the general talking about reconciliation to getting into specifics. Like, so, is it reconciliation around land? Is it reconciliation around fishing sites? Is it reconciliation around post-secondary education or other education or human rights? So, and then once we've done that kind of identification, then we can start looking at what are the resources that can be drawn upon from an Indigenous perspective, from Indigenous legal perspectives, and then from other perspectives that are involved. And so I think specificity is critical in terms of how we frame our definitions of reconciliation. And I also think that if we can be clear about what is shaping our expectations, that we'll have a better chance of actually having constructive dialogue between peoples, and not just non-Indigenous and Indigenous, but between Indigenous peoples as well, and within our communities. So I'm out of time, but there are specific examples, like whether it's intellectual property, whether it's housing, whether it's, we have to you can't solve problems on a general basis. We need the big ideas and the aspirations, absolutely, because they're our vision, but we need to solve the problems between human beings and communities. And so we have to look at the big picture and then all of the little pictures as well. So thanks. I look forward to hearing Ghislaine, and thank you, Janice.
Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more. I had a list of questions and I've thrown it out the door. I have a new list now based on some of these initial openings. So thank you so much. And Ghislaine, over to you. The floor is yours. Ghislaine, I can't hear you. I think you might still be on mute. There you are.
Right. Yeah, that's inexcusable.
You're back.
After almost 2 years operating through Zoom and Teams and what have you. So thank you, Emily, for this introduction and for giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts on reconciliation. And I will do some of that in French because that's the language I was educated in my early years, and I'll try to provide a conclusion en anglais. But let me start with my own language. Just a few words to provide greetings to my co-panelists today, and certainly appreciate the time that we have to share these few minutes and speaking about reconciliation. It's a big word. It provides a lot. We face very different definitions depending on the situations that we find ourselves in. And to me, we're talking about future steps, but I think it's happening now. So I think we have to reflect on that I would say continually, and adapt to the situations that we find ourselves in. Donc, just a few words en français. Je suis, comme ça a été dit plus tôt, de la communauté Innu de Pessamit. C'est, je vais vous situer géographiquement, la ville de Québec. La communauté de Pessamit est située à 5 heures de route à l'est de Québec. Et c'est sur le bord, les bords du fleuve Saint-Laurent, une communauté de 4000 personnes. C'est quand même une communauté assez grande, hein, si on regarde l'ensemble des communautés à travers le pays. Je pense à des communautés sur la côte ouest, hein, en Colombie-Britannique, où il y a à peine quelques dizaines de membres. Donc, je regarde pas pour dire que je suis extrêmement fier, mais c'est une grosse communauté pessamite et avec ses défis comme partout ailleurs, et le défi de cohabitation aussi qui se pose entre notre communauté et les municipalités québécoises autour. Et on parle de réconciliation et écoutez, j'ai l'impression que je travaillais déjà vers la réconciliation avant même que le mot devienne aussi populaire qu'il l'est depuis quelques années. Ça fait déjà plusieurs dizaines d'années que j'agis politiquement au nom, oui, de la nation Innu, mais au nom des 10 nations qui sont situées au Québec. Et très, très tôt dans mon parcours, j'ai vu que parmi mes responsabilités, la question de l'éducation prenait une place importante. Et à chaque fois que l'occasion s'y prêtait, je n'hésitais pas à saisir les opportunités, saisir les invitations pour également éduquer les gens autour de nous. Et je pense que c'est resté en moi là, tout au long des 30 dernières années, et de façon encore plus marquée depuis peut-être les 4-5 dernières années, parce que je pense qu'il n'y a personne qui peut nier le fait que la réalité autochtone, les enjeux autochtones n'ont jamais occupé autant de place que depuis les 3 dernières années. Donc, c'est important pour moi de le situer parce que j'ajouterais, puis je le dis là, en tout respect, et on insiste beaucoup sur le fait que le contexte du Québec présente une réalité différente, présente aussi des défis qui sont différents. Si on parle de réconciliation au Québec, on a droit à plusieurs définitions. Mais là où on constate peut-être un certain recul par rapport au reste du pays, c'est qu'il y a une hésitation importante chez certaines personnes d'adhérer à la notion de réconciliation, parce que l'interprétation, c'est que réconciliation signifie qu'on est fautif de quelque chose. Et c'est une notion qui est beaucoup véhiculée au Québec notamment, et je crois que c'est important de situer ça également. Écoutez, j'étais plutôt aujourd'hui, je pense que c'est mon 7e Zoom aujourd'hui, et parmi les 6 Zooms qui ont précédé, j'ai eu 2 entretiens avec le ministre aux Affaires autochtones du gouvernement du Québec. Et je constate qu'il y a un fossé énorme là, qui nous sépare entre notre vision de la réalité qui est la nôtre et la vision très, très, je dirais, segmentée du gouvernement provincial au Québec. Et ça ajoute énormément aux défis qui se présentent à nous pour favoriser pour favoriser des démarches en vue d'une réconciliation qui soit durable. Just a few words to say that it seems like I've been at this for many, many years, even before reconciliation became the buzzword. And to me, it's very important that we find a way, and I really want to thank Janice and Val for their thoughts on this issue, because I picked up from there, because from what I heard, I could easily identify with the challenges that we have as nations in Quebec, 10 different nations, 40 communities, French and English, as part of the reality that we find ourselves in. And what I heard, and this is really what's been driving us for the past 2 years, is the fact that where we seem to be facing walls when it comes to political engagement with governments, we tend to find a way to look the other way and look at ourselves as societies, as First Nations, but along with the society around us. And this is why back in 2020, last year, we presented a plan that involved the main objective was really to create alliances with the society around us in order to bring down the walls of racism and discrimination. And we've been at this for the past 12 months. It's provided very positive results. As a matter of fact, the plan was designed following a survey that we conducted back in July of 2020, which concluded that at least 9 out of 10 Quebecers felt that First Nations were victims of racism. So we said, well, we have a lot to go on, and that provides us certainly our belief that there's something to be accomplished here. And so the idea was really, for the past 12 months, to find ways to create alliances with the society around us through civil society. And we've garnered many allies in the last 12 months. Where we seem to be stalling is when it's time to engage with government, or I should say governments. And there we may have a positive way out, because what we've done as well is try to engage municipalities in the province, because you have the province, you have the feds, and then you have the municipalities as governments as well. And so back in 2017, Montreal, the city of Montreal, celebrated 375 years since its founding. And at the time, we quickly engaged with the mayor at the time, and we agreed on key actions to be taken. For one, the flag of the city of Montreal has now that white pine. Well, on the flag it's orange, but the symbol is the white pine, which obviously speaks to peace. And then there's the land acknowledgement too, as well, has taken place more and more throughout the province, with I would say with a provincial government not wanting to go there. And this is what I spoke to earlier en français, in French. This government is very hesitant in very close on the idea that they're responsible for something, and so land acknowledgement doesn't find anyone within government that will go that route. And the other option, and I think I heard this earlier, the other side of it is the need for non-Indigenous people to understand that reconciliation has also needs also to happen within. And a lot of our people are speaking about that as well. Reconciliation with our past, reconciliation with our own relationship as Indigenous people, which is very, very key. And so we say that, now that we have a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which speaks to self-determination, we have to make sure that we have the conditions to be self-determining people. And to me, it's very key as well. So, education is also about making sure that those values that our people have lost through colonization are brought back. Self-esteem, confidence, and confidence that there's a better tomorrow for all of us, and that we have the right conditions to nourish, I would say, that coexistence with the people around us. I think people have to believe in it. So that's a lot of our work is also about that. The last thing I want to mention, it's very important because at the end of November, we will be holding a 2-day conference under the theme, the great economic circle of Indigenous peoples and Quebec. And what we have there, since everyone worldwide speaks about resetting our economies, we say, well, maybe for once we're finding ourselves on the same starting line with governments. So we're telling them this is an opportunity to get us involved as Indigenous peoples in order to establish and secure our own economies as nations. And what we're doing is we're, again, in the spirit of alliances, creating alliances with the private sector, with the industry and civil society again. And under the theme of, if we're going to speak about reconciliation, we also have to speak about economic reconciliation, which is a very important conditions, because I don't think we need to say more about the large and wide gaps that we see in terms of opportunities for our people, as opposed to opportunities for the rest of Canada. So this is, in short, what we are involved in, and trying to always secure the right conditions in order to move forward. Merci beaucoup. Jusqu'à maintenant.
Thank you so much for that opening. Definitely have some questions following up as well. One of my questions was about economic reconciliation, so we will come back to that. And I thank you, Janice, for identifying that many different peoples and communities don't use the term reconciliation, but have found the words in their languages that are most appropriate to use, and to rethink this, rather than the restoration of friendly relations. I was up in Haida Gwaii recently, and a 12-year-old Haida boy, we were talking about reconciliation, and he said, well, I learned that, what did we do wrong? How do we get back to restoring friendly relations when they were never really at that point? So even kids are asking those questions and trying to identify what maybe turning things around and making them right are in their language. So thank you for identifying that in your language. And I might ask the others to see if there's a word in your languages that are most aligned to this concept of reconciliation. But Janice, you mentioned that you have come to understand the spirit of reconciliation as being inherently entwined with land, language, and kinship. And of course, we've been seeing this land back movement across, Turtle Island, across North America. Can you tell me your thoughts on what the land back movement is and what you think that actually means in practice on the ground?
Thank you for the question, Emily. I was actually very seriously thinking about this for the last several days, because thinking about this talk today, and I wanted to address it in my words, but I struggle with it. I know theoretically and I know philosophically what I would like, what I think it means, returning jurisdiction of our lands to our people, having the right to make decisions about what happens with our lands and on our lands. In my teachings as a Haga woman, it's like we are the holders of the land, but none of us own it. Our children who are not born yet are the ones who own it, and so there's all of our traditional teachings and that come into play. I struggle with how, as you ask, what does that look like on the ground? Like, how do we, I think about that even here at the university, because there are parcels of land that we're talking about, should we give this an Indigenous name, or how do we implement reconciliation? How do we implement land back? Unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to regain control of all of our traditional homelands, but there needs to be a way that we have a say over what happens on those lands, with those lands, but that it has to be done in partnership with everybody else who lives there. That's part of what we've always done as peoples, is we work together. That two-row wampum, right? The two-row wampum speaks to us being having our own ways, and the settlers having their own ways, and working and living side by side and not interfering with each other. And I think it's that interference with each other that's caused a lot of the problems, where we know how we're supposed to live as human beings, and we need to be able to enact that in everything we do on the land that we live on.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to turn it now to Val. Val, if you have any, connected thoughts to that, and I think a connected conversation, especially in the realm that you're in, is there are right now, as we speak, Indigenous peoples who are upholding their Indigenous laws, sometimes in opposition to the wants and desires and laws of colonial bodies or government or industry. This is happening in Gitxsan territory actually right now. So how do we reconcile or restore some of this tension in these conflations of Indigenous law and colonial law?
Thank you for that. Just a bit of information, because Ghislaine, rightfully pointed out that some of our communities in British Columbia are small. I think it's important to think on a legal order basis, so that there's a Gitxsan legal order. There are 6 Gitxsan communities. There's 7 Tsimshian communities. There is a overall Tsimshian legal order. So when I'm talking about law, it's not community by community, because that wouldn't make any sense. So I think that when thinking about reconciliation, what we're talking about, okay, it depends on what subject area what's the context. So that's important. But often what people are thinking about is relationships between people. And if you look at the laws of peoples like the Tsilhqot'in or others, there are international obligations within a legal order insofar as how to maintain relationships with neighbors. So, if someone comes onto Tsilhqot'in territory, there's an obligation to teach the laws to that person. If Tsilhqot'in people go to another's territory, there is an obligation to learn the laws of the other place. So within the international laws of different societies, there are practices which can be understood as comprising reconciliation. So this is not a new concept for Indigenous peoples. We had to get along, and we did get along. And when law failed, there were wars, which then had to be lawfully rebuilt from. So I think that's an important piece here. And I think you're right. There are lots of examples of conflicts that are going on. And I think that the way forward is, whether it's Gitxsan or Wet'suwet'en or Cree or whatever, that, the work, law has to be understandable, it has to be accessible, and it has to be applicable to what people are dealing with. We can't just tell each other what our laws are, right? The application of laws means you have decision makers, you have legal processes, you have legal responses, you have legitimacy and accountability. Like, those are necessary in order for any application of law to be legal in a society. So that's one thing. the other thing is that back to internal reconciliations, many Indigenous communities across northern British Columbia and Alberta are intersocietal as a result of historic and recent history. So there are Daneza and Cree communities, which people navigate to varying degrees of success. So when I'm working with, northern communities, I have to think about more than one legal order and what are the laws that apply, what are the processes that apply, and bring those together so that people can work from their respective legal perspective, from their terms of legitimacy to solve problems. So we don't, I don't think we have many homogenous communities anymore. So we have to deal with another level of internalization, which has been sped up by colonization. So, we've always had adoption of peoples over time, right? We've always done that. And now there's additional demands that we have to meet in order to be able to have our communities be peaceful. And I think that where there are conflicts, what needs to happen is a rebuilding of Indigenous law so that we don't just tell each other. So, I mean, that would be like Canada saying to Indigenous peoples, listing the laws. It has to be more than that. Like that's not the way law works.
Thank you so much. Do any of you have any thoughts just based off of those two initial questions that you want to add to? Otherwise, I will turn it over to Ghislaine with a question. Ghislaine, you mentioned economic reconciliation. Can you share a little bit more of what that would look like in some of the work that you're involved in, perhaps some of the biggest barriers that you're facing in attaining economic reconciliation?
If I could be allowed, I will answer in French. Je veux juste peut-être m'inspirer du commentaire de Janice un peu plus tôt sur la question du territoire. Et c'est en partie ce qui est soulevé également par Val. Et je pense que la question du territoire est au cœur de ce qui se pose comme obstacle à la réconciliation. Ce qui arrive, ce qu'on entend beaucoup au Québec, particulièrement au Québec, c'est parce que le Québec est un peu similaire au niveau géopolitique à la Colombie-Britannique. Hein? Il y a encore des parties importantes du territoire qui sont grevées du titre autochtone. Hein? Et ça, c'est important de le rappeler parce que c'est uniquement plus des régions nordiques chez les Inuits et les Cris et Naskapi où il y a eu des accords, hein, des traités modernes. Et ce que je trouve trop souvent, c'est que la place qui est recherchée par les Premières Nations fait l'objet d'exagération verbale. Et parce que, mon avis, c'est que le contexte n'est pas assez bien compris. Et ce qui est triste, c'est que le contexte n'est pas assez bien compris par les gouvernements. Je parle du gouvernement du Québec en particulier, le présent gouvernement. Donc, c'est extrêmement difficile pour nous d'engager le gouvernement provincial dans un processus politique qui puisse donner des résultats. Je me permets juste un exemple. La nation dont je fais partie, la nation Innu, est à la table de négociation depuis près de 50 ans pour régler le contentieux territorial. Et ça, c'est juste un exemple, une nation, il y en a d'autres. Et donc, pour nous, les tentatives au niveau de certaines nations, c'est d'assurer un minimum au niveau économique à l'aide de projets, création d'emplois et faciliter finalement l'accessibilité pour nos communautés à une espèce de croissance économique. Et parce que la réconciliation est un terme qui est populaire, courant maintenant, Nous, on a saisi l'opportunité pour dire, OK, est-ce qu'on ne peut pas trouver une façon de relever le défi et de poser le défi aux gens autour de nous, le Québec Inc., les sociétés d'État, et permettre finalement que nos communautés puissent avoir un accès équitable à une économie qui soit la leur. Et ça touche beaucoup la question territoriale. Et je vais participer lundi prochain à la signature d'une entente avec une compagnie minière et une communauté de la nation Anishinaabe. Et la compagnie minière, dans l'entente qui est signée, reconnaît l'existence d'un territoire traditionnel, ce que le gouvernement du Québec n'oserait jamais faire. Et pour moi, ben c'est exactement ces partenariats-là, ces alliances-là qu'on peut créer avec autant l'entreprise privée que les sociétés d'État, que la société civile, qui sont, à mon avis, porteuses d'un avenir beaucoup plus positif. Donc, l'esprit du grand rendez-vous qu'on propose à la fin du mois de novembre, c'est celui-là. C'est est-ce qu'on peut, tout le monde, s'engager vers cette réconciliation économique qui va permettre à nos communautés de s'éloigner de la dépendance étatique et de pouvoir compétitionner avec le monde autour d'eux. Il y a maintenant plus de 5 ans, la nation Mi'kmaq co-gère est propriétaire d'un parc éolien dans la région de la Gaspésie. En février dernier, la nation Innu a fait l'annonce d'un autre projet éolien, Wind Farm, sur son territoire ancestral. Et donc, ça me fait dire qu'il y a un potentiel, une possibilité pour les communautés d'être aussi détenteurs de projets majeurs. La chef nationale, Roseanne Archibald, à l'époque où elle était chef régionale pour l'Ontario, disait, parce que l'Ontario, c'est the Circle of Fire, c'est beaucoup de mines. Et elle disait, bon, oui, c'est bon pour les communautés d'avoir des emplois, c'est bon pour les communautés d'avoir du revenue sharing, hein, partage des revenus, mais elle disait aussi, pourquoi nos communautés ne pourraient pas être propriétaires d'une mine? Et c'est là qu'entrent en jeu là, les références par rapport au territoire qui sont extrêmement, extrêmement importantes parce que pour moi, c'est vraiment un des grands contentieux actuellement où personne n'a de solution, personne n'a de porte de sortie. Et là-dessus, d'ailleurs, toutes les juridictions provinciales, territoriales, gouvernement fédéral adoptent le même recul. Hein? Il n'y a personne qui ose s'aventurer sur ce terrain-là. Donc, pour moi, là, c'est une façon de peut-être signifier notre intention là, de vraiment nous-mêmes prendre l'initiative de prendre notre économie en main.
Thank you for that. Before I ask my next question, Val or Janice, do you have any comments?
I do. I appreciate that. So I think that the work of looking at our economies is similar in depth and scope as it is to look at our laws. I think that there are Indigenous, we had our economies, which informed our laws, and all of that is a part of how we governed ourselves. And so I think that there's opportunities here to rethink what an economy is. I think that there are opportunities here to define what wealth is from Indigenous perspectives. I think that there are big opportunities to think of our obligations to each other and to the earth and to the planet. And I think that that's necessary as we start to look at partnerships with industry and other, thinking about other forms of generating, building an economy that the care is like, do we want to sort of take the worst of the capitalist economy and recreate that within our what our peoples do? So, in looking at this question, again, in some of the work I've been doing recently with Northern communities, like people have this, obligations to look at what the relationships are with new parties and to determine whether they're harmful or not to the people and to the land. And if they're not harmful, there's obligations to build healthy relationships and to make decisions based on those healthy relationships. So again, it's another situation where we can draw on governing processes, citizenry building, in order to rethink economy, like to think beyond what most industries are thinking about. And I think we just need to challenge so much of that. Not all jobs are created equal. We know that. Most of these large scale projects have a definite lifespan. They end, and then what do people have? So.
Thank you for that. Janice, did you have any other comments there? No, okay. I'm mindful that we have about, yeah, sure.
If I could, maybe just to follow up on Val's comment, I think it's certainly very important as well. And this is where I sort of, define it as a challenge for, leadership to provide that balance. And obviously, when we looked around us, there are lessons learned in terms of the land, how it was developed, and we don't want to repeat, the same mistakes we were victims of. But at the same time, I think everybody understands that there needs to be a proper balance between the how you design your development and how you continue to care for the land. And I think it's part of the challenge, but at the same time, I would say another big part of that is how do you ensure that there's input from your peoples, and that's a challenge as well, because I grew up in my community, and I see this with all the respect, when I was younger, where, and it's probably common to many communities, is we had people who were very passive to what others were deciding for them. So we need to, in a way, almost re-educate ourselves, to take charge. And I was referring to two major projects, wind farm projects, who, in one case, it's been producing energy for the past maybe 7 years already. And in the other case, well, it's a project that's supposed to be up within, a couple of years. And to me, these are the type of choices that communities make for themselves. And where it is important, what's important to say is the fact that this happens almost outside government. And governments are the one, presenting themselves as championing Indigenous rights, but they really had nothing to do with it, because everything happened on the ground, between municipalities and our own communities. They're the ones who design, the projects. And the other notion that we're trying to introduce in our reflection is the notion of social economy, which is really close to, our own traditional economies as nations. And we want to, put value into that, and again, set our own conditions, which people will have to adhere to, in order to create partnerships. So I think this is a very important discussion, from a larger scale.
Thank you for that. We have about 10 minutes left, so I do want to leave with a positive question, leave on a positive note, although there are a lot of positive insights that have come out. I can't help thinking some of my work has been involved in education on the history of newspapers and the role that media has played in a lot of misinformation over the years and changing that so that we have a newer and higher standard of accuracy, especially when it comes to reporting on Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. But one message that I'm hearing glaringly come out from this conversation is the need for more education, accurate education. There's so much to learn about Indigenous legal traditions, intersocietal communities, Indigenous economies outside of capitalism. There's so much Indigenous knowledge and wealth that provide insight on how to grapple with the changing climate and the future that comes in these uncertain times. So it's exciting, but at the same time, it needs to be accessible to the public. People need to be educated. They need to understand that there's more than just the Canadian legal order, right? And that it's fairly recent history. So I hear this cry for more education in the media and in schools, and I'm right there. I think that that's an important message to take from this. One thing I wanted to ask, just to leave on a positive note for each of you, is, you know, Janice talked about some of the unlearning and relearning that she's been a part of. Val talked about the fact that there's this cohort of, you know, law students that are now entering the world as lawyers who are equipped with this knowledge, which is, to me, so exciting. These are, you know, it's changing of tides. You know, this wouldn't have happened just a few decades ago, right? So I do get excited to hear about these things, and I'd love for you to just breathe life into other, you know, places where you've seen reconciliation in action, for lack of a better term, where you've been excited by the progress and change in the work that you're each involved in. If we could start with Janice and then Val and then end with Ghislaine. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I too get excited by the potential, by the possibility, as well as by what has happened. I don't know if all of you know a lot about Queen's University, but we do have a reputation for being, you know, very, I don't even know the proper word, not the place where you're going to think you're going to find reconciliation happening, but it has, you know, in the short time, like in the last, you know, maybe 3 to 5 years, there's been so much change. I've seen so much happen here, and that has really encouraged me in the work that I do here. There are a lot of allies becoming accomplices, right? From, you know, the students who come here to learn, to the governing bodies who see the value in the education of learning about Indigenous ways of knowing and being, incorporating that into how we do business, not only content, but the way we do business with each other, you know, thinking about the barriers that our people face, our young people face in coming to post-secondary education. And we're not alone. Other racialized and marginalized populations suffer from the same things, but we learn from each other, and we have been learning from each other. So we are working together to break down those barriers, you know, and to make this place more accessible, more open, working to try and make it so that people feel like they belong here, they have a place here, that they're visible here. We hang Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee flags all over our campus now to be a welcoming place. Also LGBTQ2+ and trans flags due to things that have happened in our community here. But we're working very hard to try and change the things we can and to make that education accessible, not only formally in our credit courses, but we have training programs that are professional development that we're just now working on, making open to our community partners and collaborators. You don't have to be affiliated with the university. So trying to make opportunities available for people far and wide. And I think that I see so many people here engaging on this, in this work, pushing it forward and seeing the value and importance of it. And that to me is encouraging.
I think that it's hope and optimism that's going to create change, which is going to enable people to make change. Pessimism, I heard described as the worst form of arrogance, right? You just get locked in a corner and don't do nothing. So, you know, I think we all have obligations to create hope for like my grandsons, my grandchildren. I want them to have hope. Otherwise, you know, what do they have to look forward to in this world? So that's our responsibility, is to create that. But it has to be informed. It has to, I think that the biggest challenge for Indigenous communities is to rebuild our citizenries as thinking, engaged peoples who are able to take up the challenges of the day. I think that, you know, like what we're talking about, we have to internalize it. We have to internalize our laws. We have to, you know, otherwise, you know, things, it's just words, right? And so there has to be a way of, we have to look at, you know, historic pedagogies and contemporary pedagogies and start supporting the practices of having people visit one another, to have kitchen table discussions. I mean, so these are all things that we're doing, you know, in communities that we work with. There are lots of wonderful examples in BC and, you know, elsewhere too, of where people have brought together concerns about the rivers, and they're acting on their responsibilities for rivers insofar as the management and the protection of those resources of water and fish. So we see that on Haida Gwaii, we see that with Gitniao, we see that with the Cowichan. There's lots of examples of good work, solid work, because people are practical and they want to solve problems. So I'm inspired by all of the work that people are doing. And just recently, like today, there's folks in Secwepemc country who have negotiated an impact benefit agreement, but it's negotiated on the basis of UNDRIP, right? So the obligations of UNDRIP now become part of how people are negotiating the political and legal and economic relationships that they want to have to guide them. So you know, these are examples of what's going on that will continue to give hope. I think that's really, really important.
Well, you all give me so much hope, all of the work that you're involved in. Ghislaine, we have about just a few minutes left if you just want to share.
Yes, I saw that. I think this is a good time to say that it's been a pleasure sharing the screen with Janice, Val, and yourself, Emily. A very interesting discussion. For a number of years now, I tend to see the glass half full. It's not always been like that, but I think I'm certainly more encouraged now with what I see, what I hear around me. And I think it's really in the capacity of our peoples to really look at the challenges before them as opportunities. And I think that really speaks about, you know, their readiness to, you know, to ensure that, you know, that transition happens into where, you know, we somewhat leave the state behind and become self-determining peoples. And I think that's really, I think everybody's in agreement with, you know, that objective. And it's a matter of respecting the rhythm of everyone. I think we have a lot of people in Quebec communities that could say, well, you know, I can get there before you, but people are, you know, minded in such a way that they say, well, let's do it together. You know, and to me, that's really the spirit that, you know, we try to encourage and support within our work.
Thank you so much to each of you for your time and your insights today. It felt like a really meaningful, heart-centered conversation, one that took reconciliation beyond its discursive realm and into the actual on-the-ground work that you're each involved in. So I myself learned a lot, and I'm excited by all of the work that you're involved in and by the thoughts that you brought forward. I love this idea of embodying our laws and, you know, bringing things forward than just the thought, the mental realm, and into action. So thank you so much to the McGill Institute on the Study of Canada for organizing this event today. Thank you to each of our panelists for sharing your insight, and for everyone who's joined us in this great conversation. We hope that everyone enjoys watching this conference. There are more events that you can attend, and you can check out this recording later on. So a big hi. Thank you so much to each of you, and we'll see you again, hopefully around a kitchen table someday.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anna.
Thank you all very much.